Self-Inflicted Doom, by Stephen Lake. Tom walked into his dad's small hardware store and strolled slowly towards the back of it where his father was putting together a new display rack. "What you doing, Pops?" he asked with a hint of sarcasm. "We just signed on with a new supplier. So we're gonna be carrying their tools in our store from now on. Do you want to help me put together this display they sent us?" said his dad. Tom glared at him. He didn't want to do it, but he really had no other choice. He couldn't get work anywhere else, so he either worked for his dad, or he went hungry. Just then the doorbell rang, signaling that someone had just entered. "I'll get this. You take care of the till," he grumbled. His dad looked at him with muted displeasure at his attitude, and then slipped away to see to his new customer. Tom immediately got to work assembling the display in much the same way he'd done with dozens of others before it. It wasn't long before he had it assembled, in place, and fully stocked. Just then the town clock rang out the time. It was 8 in the evening. Time to close up for the day. He turned and hurried to the front, tossed his apron on the counter, and rushed out the door. This was his normal routine every day, so his dad didn't say anything about it. He then jumped on his bike and hurried across town to meet up with his buddies to drink their sorrows away like they did every night. But as he drew close to the bar, the only one in his tiny, barely a speck on the map little southern town, he noticed that the street it was on was blocked off by numerous cop cars and fire engines. Curious to see what was happening, he pulled around the barriers, and then saw something that made his heart sink. The town bar had burned to the ground. All that remained anymore was a large, smoldering hole where the building had once stood. Just then, upon hearing him enter, one of the local cops turned and walked over to him. "Sorry, son, but you'll have to turn around," said the policeman. "What happened?" asked Tom. "Nobody's certain. The place was getting ready to open up for the afternoon when suddenly it caught fire and burned to the ground. It went up so fast that the main floor was in the basement before anyone could get down here and put any water on it." Tom grit his teeth angrily at this and gunned his engine, sending a thick cloud of burnt rubber and tar into the air. The bike then spun around and accelerated down the street as he quickly made his way out into the country. First his life had been destroyed by his dad, and now his favorite place to drink was gone. Everything in his life was constantly going wrong, and it was all his dad's fault, and never his, because he was perfect and never did anything wrong. Or, at least that's how he saw reality, as the truth was considerably different than how he perceived it. He continued on down a long, dark, winding stretch of country road that wandered through the Virginia hillsides like a drunken snake as anger welled up within him. But as he did, his bike suddenly started lurching, and then completely stalled. Soon the lights flickered and everything on the bike died. He put the transmission into neutral and tried to start it again. However, even the starter wouldn't work. He then tried jumping it with his last bit of momentum, but got nothing but dead, hollow coughs from the engine. Something was very wrong. Seeing a nearby farmhouse, he pulled into the driveway, climbed off his bike, and checked the tank. It was almost full. A moment later a light on the porch of the nearby farmhouse turned on and a man in a pair of blue overalls stepped out the door holding a double-barreled shotgun and a flashlight. He studied Tom with interest for a moment, and then lowered his shotgun as he realized who it was. "You're John's boy, aren't you?" asked the farmer. "Yeah, that's me." "What's up with the searchlight?" protested Tom. "Oh, just making sure you ain't one of them miscreants from town. They've been right in my hen house a lot lately." "So what you doing way out here, boy?" "My bike broke down." "What's it look like to you?" said Tom snidely. "It broke down, did it? Well, why don't you roll that thing into my shop and let's have us a gander at it," replied the farmer. Tom studied the man curiously, uncertain why he'd be so nice, but eventually decided not to dwell on it. So he did as he was told and rolled his bike up to the farmer's shop. The farmer then opened the door and the two stepped inside. What Tom found in there was far more than he expected. The room was filled with machines and gadgets the likes of which he'd never seen before. "What's all this?" he asked. "Oh, this? Just some experiments. I like to tinker during the off-season. It keeps me busy when there's nothing to do, said the farmer. I thought a farm was a full-time job. The farmer laughed. Not for me, it isn't. Almost everything around here is automated. So all I have to do is plant and harvest the crops. My machines do the rest. Now, let's get a good look at that bike of yours. He walked over to Tom's motorcycle, shined a flashlight on the engine, and began muttering some things that Tom couldn't quite make out. As the farmer continued to tinker, Tom decided to explore a little. As he wandered towards the back of the shed, he stumbled onto an object that looked like a gigantic phone booth covered in wires. "What's this thing?" he asked. The farmer looked up from his work and, upon seeing what Tom was standing next to, grinned. "Oh, that? Ah, that's nothing. Just a time machine I made." Tom gave him a disbelieving look. "A time machine? Are you nuts?" he replied incredulously. "Oh, no. I'm quite serious. In fact, I've used it a couple of times myself to visit various places in history. It's a lot of fun. You just have to be really careful not to change anything in the past, or you could do some nasty things to the present and the future." Tom gave an incredulous nod, and said in disbelief, "Yeah, right." The farmer walked over to him, and said, "Want to try it? I can prove to you that it works." Deciding that he had nothing better to do, Tom shrugged, and said, "Sure, why not? All right, I'm gonna make this simple. I'll send you a couple hours into the past, give you a few minutes to look around, and then bring you back. How's that sound?" "Sure, whatever," muttered Tom. The farmer opened the door to the device, and said, "All right, go ahead and step inside." Tom soon obliged, after which the farmer closed the door behind him. The next thing he heard was a few whirs and a click, and then Tom suddenly found himself standing in the basement of the town bar. He knew the place well, because he'd been down there several times before. Even so, he was still surprised to be there nonetheless. Turning to a nearby clock, he walked over to it and read the time. For a moment he thought it was broken, as it showed that it was exactly 2 hours earlier. That was impossible. Then again, so was him being there. He then jumped slightly as the door to the stairwell opened. A well-recognized thump, thump, thump was soon followed by the appearance of the bar's owner, who was a good friend of his. As soon as the bar owner reached the bottom of the stairs, he turned, and then nearly tripped over himself when he saw Tom. "What in the blazes are you doing down here?" he said in shock. Tom shrugged. "I don't know. I was somewhere else one moment, and then I was here the next." The bartender took a step back in disbelief, bumping a shelf as he did, and then quickly stepped away as it collapsed, sending dozens of bottles of hard liqueur crashing to the floor. But as it did, it bumped the light fixture above it, shattering the bulb. It flashed brightly, and then went out, sending a hot cinder from the element floating gently to the floor. A moment later a whoosh filled the room as the liqueur caught fire and erupted into a brilliant blue fireball. Tom raised his arms in fear, and then suddenly heard nothing except the gentle whir of machinery. He lowered his arms and looked around in surprise. He was back at the farmer's tool shed again, inside the wire-covered phone booth. A moment later the door opened to reveal the farmer, who quietly studied his startled volunteer. "So, how was the ride? Sorry it took so long to get you back. The machine reset itself, so it took me a couple hours to figure out where I'd sent you," said the farmer. "What do you mean?" "I was only gone for a minute at most," said Tom, half disbelieving his own words. "Actually, you've been gone for several hours. But that's all right. Everything is relative when it comes to time travel. Either way, I have your bike fixed. I did that while I was waiting for the machine to find you again. Now you better get home before it gets too late." Tom stepped out of the booth and quietly studied the tool shed before noticing the clock on the far wall. It was indeed several hours later. He cocked an eyebrow at this. Clearly the time machine worked. Or else his dad's friend was really good at making other people think so. He then thanked the farmer, paid him for his efforts, and soon hurried off for home. The next day, as he worked his normal shift at his dad's hardware store, he spent a good portion of his time thinking about the events of the previous day, and what that might mean for him. Later that afternoon his dad ascended the stairs to the second floor where he found Tom doing inventory as usual. "Hey, how's things going?" he asked. Tom shrugged. "As well as can be expected," said Tom. "That's good to hear. So, do you mind if I ask you something?" said his dad. "What is it, Pop?" said Tom, not taking his eyes off his work. "A couple of policemen came by here earlier today asking about you. They wanted to know where you were at around 6 o'clock yesterday. I told them you were in the back doing inventory." Tom looked at his dad curiously. "Why would they come here asking where I was?" "They know I'm here all day," he replied gruffly. "Remember that fire at the bar yesterday?" Tom nodded curiously. "Yeah, I do. What about it?" "Well, the bartender claims he saw you in the basement around 6, right before the fire started. Apparently he was so startled to see you that he knocked over a rack of booze which caught fire and ended up burning the place to the ground," said his dad. Memories of his brief time in the basement of the bar flashed into Tom's mind. "So I really was there," he thought. Tom smirked. "Are you sure he wasn't sipping a little too much of his own brew and imagining things?" he replied sarcastically. His dad shrugged. "Well, that's what the cops think. But they wanted to be sure you weren't involved. I mean, you don't exactly have the best reputation around here, you know." Yeah, I know that," grumbled Tom. "Well, I just figured to ask." "Thanks," said his dad. He then made his way downstairs again. Tom rolled his eyes at this, and then returned to his work. However, it wasn't long before a thought struck him. The farmer's time machine really worked. If he could get into that shop tonight, he might be able to use it to get revenge on everyone who'd destroyed his life, starting with his dad. An evil grin crossed his face. This would be too easy. And the best part was, they'd never know it was him, nor could they prove it. Later that evening Tom drove his motorcycle back to the farmer's house. But, instead of entering at the driveway, he pulled off onto a side road, grabbed his rifle and slipped across a field to the shop. Aside from some noises made by a couple of chickens, it was completely quiet. So Tom carefully walked over to the back door, picked the lock, and then slipped inside. Remembering what he'd seen the farmer do, he walked over to the machine and quickly set about programming it for his intended destination. Namely, a memorable moment in his past. He tried his best to remember a time when he knew his dad would be outside and vulnerable. He had to be careful though not to go too far back as he risked erasing himself if he did. So he racked his brain for several minutes trying his best to remember before eventually thinking of something. And, while he didn't have an exact date and time, he was hoping to get close enough to still get the job done. So he quickly entered his best guess as to the correct date and time, grabbed his rifle, slipped into the box, and closed the door. A moment later he found himself in a dark, grassy field behind his old house. A younger version of himself was sitting outside on the porch looking up at the stars. This was exactly what he wanted. Now all he needed to do was wait for his dad. "Tom." "It's bedtime," came his mother's voice in the distance. Tom watched as his younger self soon got up and skipped inside. A few minutes later his dad came outside, wandered briefly in the yard, and then vanished around the side of the house. Tom swore. He only had a few minutes left before the time machine recalled him, and if he didn't move quickly, he would lose his chance to get his revenge. So he hurried across the field and over to a nearby fence post. He then raised his rifle and took aim at a dark spot on the side of the house. It didn't move. Uncertain of whether it was just a shadow or his dad, he stood up and shouted his dad's name. The dark shape moved. A grin of evil satisfaction crossed Tom's face. This was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "It's payback time, old man," he said with cold satisfaction. Suddenly the dark form turned and bolted. Tom quickly lined it up in his sights and pulled the trigger. The figure staggered briefly, and then collapsed to the ground. Tom raised his rifle in dark, sinister glee, and then found himself back at the farm a moment later. Satisfied that he'd achieved his goal, he quietly stepped out of the booth, turned off the machine, and then made his way back to town. The next morning he walked down to his dad's hardware store expecting to discover that his dad would be long dead, and life for him would be much better now. However, to his complete and total surprise, his dad was not only alive, but he didn't appear to have changed in the slightest. Tom walked curiously into the store and up to his dad. "Hey Pop. How are you doing this morning?" he asked, not sure if he should believe his eyes. "Oh, doing just fine. Why are you up so early? You're normally not here when I open up." Tom shrugged. "Oh, I don't know. With the bar gone, I had nothing better to do, so I went to bed early." "Well, since you're here, if you want to, we still need to finish that inventory." "Sure, why not?" said Tom as he grabbed an apron and put it on. He then started towards the stairs to the second floor before pausing and turning back to look at his dad. "Hey, Pop. Can I ask you a question?" he asked. "Sure, son." "What's up?" asked his dad. "Well, this might sound a little weird, but you remember our old house, right?" His dad nodded. "Yeah, I do. You used to sit on the porch every night and stare at the sky until Mom called you in. Why do you ask?" Tom shrugged. "Well, I heard a rumor last night that someone got shot out there." Tom knew this to be a lie, but felt it was the best way to broach the question about why his dad was still alive without sounding too suspicious. "Recently," said his dad in surprise. "No, not recently. It was back when I was a kid. Do you remember anything about that?" His dad cocked his head slightly in curiosity. "Actually, yes, I do. You were about 8 at the time. The police think that a couple of bikers got into a fight on our property, and one of them got shot." "Do you know who it was?" asked Tom. His dad shook his head. "The cops said they'd never seen the guy before, even though he wore the same patches and tattoos of the biker gang that you ride with. Even the gang members didn't recognize him." "Did the cops ever identify him?" asked Tom. "Unfortunately, no. So we're still not sure exactly what happened." Tom swore inwardly at this. Whoever he'd shot, it wasn't who he'd wanted to kill. "Is there anything else you need to know?" asked his dad. "Nah, I'm fine. I was just curious." Tom then went about finishing up the inventory. Later that night he drove out to the farmer's house again and used the time machine to send himself back to that same night, just as before. But when he arrived this time, he discovered that he was directly east of the house. He soon spotted his younger self sitting on the porch admiring the stars. Moments later his mom called his younger self inside. This was followed shortly after by his dad stepping outside. This was exactly what he'd seen before, and exactly what he needed to see. However, just as he got ready to shoot his dad, a startling and depressing realization struck him. In his haste to leave the house, he had forgotten to bring his rifle. He swore at this. "Oh well, I guess I do this the old-fashioned way," he thought. He then grinned slyly as he pulled a large Bowie knife out of his leather vest. As crazy as it was, he actually liked the idea of killing his dad with his own bare hands. Given everything that the old man had done to him, he deserved it. At least, from Tom's perspective, anyways. Tom then hurried away in pursuit of his dad. But, when he reached the edge of the field where his dad had been standing, he was both surprised and disappointed to discover that his old man had already gone back inside. So Tom hurried across the yard and backed himself up against the house before checking his watch. There was only 2 minutes left before he'd be recalled. He had to find a way to get his dad to come out of the house again before time ran out. But just as he was trying to think of a solution to this, his mind suddenly came to a horrifying realization. He was standing in the exact same spot as the man he'd shot the night before. Cold fear ran down his back as he realized the danger of his situation. Suddenly he heard his dad's name shouted. He looked anxiously in the direction of the voice and soon spotted himself standing by a fence post, his rifle raised and at the ready. He swore as he realized that he was the one he'd shot at the night before, and there was no way he was going to allow himself to be shot by anyone, especially his past self. Not waiting a moment longer, he turned and bolted across the yard, but, before he could get more than a handful of steps, a bullet slammed into him like a hammer, knocking him to the ground. He then lay there for several moments, the life slowly draining out of him in thick, red drops, and realized, to his complete and total dismay, that he had just become his own self-inflicted doom. The end.